Hello and welcome to the Psychic Stories podcast, encouraging conversations about mental health. Today I'm speaking to Tizzy Philp. Tizzy is the Global Director of Content for Valtech, a global digital agency. Tizzy, good evening. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be here.
And we are very, very happy to have you. And the goal of today's conversation is to have an open and honest conversation about your mental health journey, get some insight into the tools, tips and techniques that have helped you and are available and accessible to other people. And by discussing your journey, we hope to share and normalize these conversations about mental health, as often people are not alone, unfortunately, in these experiences. Does that sound okay with you?
That sounds very good. And I'm very happy to do that for you.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I'd like to hand the mic over to you. Please tell us about your mental health journey.
All right, thank you. And I'll kick off by saying, first of all, thanks so much for providing this as a platform for me to speak, because certainly, as you'll go on to hear, when I was going through this myself, I didn't find many resources or conversations or tools to be able to listen to identify with someone else who was going through the same thing. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that by me talking about this, it will offer that help to someone else who maybe is in the same situation or going through the same situation. So let's start.
I was going to say, I definitely think it will.
Well, let's fingers crossed. I hope so. So for me, the story starts about 5 years ago, and it was basically a series of really tricky, difficult situations that happened one after the other. So kind of a bit of a domino effect. And it all led to what I call my brain giving up on me. I'd been in a job that I didn't love. I'm sure lots of people can identify with this. I was feeling like I was in the wrong place with the wrong team, doing the wrong thing. It wasn't making me happy. Then my family situation started to unravel a bit. So my parents got divorced, and that came with numerous complications, as divorces do. But it kind of spread out over a really long, extended period of time. So again, as divorces do, but it wasn't kind of a traditional divorce. There were just lots of complexities to it that made it super stressful. And you know, my sister and I had to support our parents a lot through that. My husband is in the army, as you know, and he was heading out for his second tour of Afghanistan. So I knew that we were coming up to a period of him being away for 6 months. And that at that time, things were pretty hairy out there. So there were lots of different things in flux at that time. But, you know, for the first year of all of those things happening, it was definitely acute stress, but it was acute stress that I felt like I could cope with. I really felt like I was fine. I felt like I was handling everything. I knew that I was under pressure, but I was dealing with it. I was, you know, it was all doable. I think I've been like that my whole life, actually, very kind of structured, stable, steady, kind of safe pair of hands. I'm always quite calm in a crisis, or had always been quite calm in a crisis. So yeah, I've always been like that, and I've always been able to kind of detach emotion from stressful situations just to be able to get the problem solved. So I very much thought that I was still in that situation and still coping. And then after about a year or so, I managed to get a new job, which was great. So I started working for Valtech, which is the company that I work for now, which is a fantastic company. I love being there. I got a new boss. You know, I made that change, which was a really empowering thing. I made that change. I left the job that I hated and sought out this new role. So took a bit of kind of, empowerment, and took charge of life a bit. Had this brilliant boss who was incredibly inspiring. I felt really great about being at work every day. I was doing something that I was totally unfamiliar with, but loved it, you know, threw myself into it wholeheartedly. Rob had just come back from tour, so that had all been okay. You know, there'd been quite a long period of time of relative calmness, and we went away for the summer. We got engaged. You know, we went through this period of there being this lovely, happy, calm balance. And that's when I had my first panic attack. And I'd never had a panic attack before. I was on the tube heading home from work, and it completely came out of nowhere. Or what I felt at the time is that it had come out of nowhere. And it was all consuming, totally all consuming. I couldn't see properly. My hands went numb. My legs went numb. I felt like I was going to faint. the intensity of a panic attack, if you haven't had one, all of your senses become heightened. And I'll talk about that, you know, in a little bit more detail later on. But noises become louder, your vision becomes brighter, colors become brighter, bolder. Everything is hugely heightened. And if that sensation of those feelings come out of nowhere, it's actually incredibly terrifying, and your heart is racing. You feel like you're going to collapse. You feel like you're going to faint. And when that kind of happens, when you're on a tube, you can't get off the tube because it's obviously moving between stations. It's absolutely petrifying. And I remember being completely blindsided by it. All I could do was get off at the next available station and get out to the air and call my best friend at the time. Well, she's still my best friend, but I called her at the time and just said, you know, this has happened. It was awful. What's going on? As time went by, you know, I kind of saw that as a one-off, but soon after they started to happen more regularly. And I got to a point where the panic attacks were happening every time I got on a tube. And, you know, I'm getting on a tube twice a day, on my way to work, on the way back from work. So ultimately I stopped getting on the tube. Then they started happening in the office, or when I was in meeting rooms, or when I was in meetings with people. So again, start to dread work, you start to dread going into meetings, you try to avoid, like, you know, you go into a meeting room and you think about where you can sit in that meeting room. So if you do need to get out, you can get out. Can I sit near a window? Can I sit near a door? All these things that you would never have ever, you know, thought about before you suddenly start thinking about.
And this is in the context of you kind of perceiving that life is actually okay.
Yeah.
At that time.
So this is the weirdest thing, you know, for me, I'd been from this place of big stress, and then life had calmed down a bit, and I was feeling much calmer, which is another reason why it took me so much by surprise and why it was so frightening, is because seemingly I was okay. I wasn't feeling the same stress that I'd felt the year before. I was feeling relatively calm.
So it wasn't a conscious trigger.
No,
it wasn't
not
something
at all.
that something. It is just it's something that could come on at literally any time.
Yes, and that's another reason why it becomes so frightening, because if you have a panic attack on a tube, you start avoiding the tube because you recognize that as a trigger, and it's the worst thing that you do, but naturally you do it. Because I stopped taking the tube, I then had to start taking the bus. So then I start having panic attacks on the bus. So then I stopped taking the bus, and then it would take me an hour and a half to get to work because I'd be walking with my backpack rather than jumping on a bus or a tube. And you're so frustrated with yourself because you're like, why can't I just get on the tube? This is ridiculous. I've been doing it all my life. Or, you know, I've been living in London for the last 6 years, loving the tube because it was the one time of your day where you didn't have phone signal and it was quiet and you could read a book or you could people watch. You know, there's nothing like getting on the tube and like looking at all the people around you. But suddenly I couldn't do all these things that have been so normal and so natural to me. And the result of that was that my world started to get smaller and smaller and smaller because I stopped traveling. You know, if a friend invited me out to a different part of London that I couldn't walk to, or there wasn't a direct bus route to, and it was going to, you know what London traffic's like, if it was going to take me an hour and a half to get across town, then I'd probably turn them down. And so my life really did start to get smaller and smaller and smaller over kind of a few weeks and months. All the while I hadn't really thought about seeing a doctor or going to my GP at that point. I recognized these as panic attacks. I knew that they were panic attacks, and I sort of assumed that I'd be able to handle them myself and I'd be able to get my head around it and sort them out. But before I'd had a chance to get my head around it, we were kind of hit with another major issue, and my dad went into hospital for quite an extended period of time, and actually it was quite serious, and we were told by the consultants to expect the worst and to say our goodbyes. So
sorry to hear that.
No, well, he's made a recovery now, but at the time, you know, I was dealing with these panic attacks, and then suddenly this major thing happened. And so actually my panic attacks, whether it was a distraction or whether it was because my brain had something bigger to think about, they eased off a little bit.
Okay.
And suddenly I was focusing entirely on Dad being in hospital. My sister and I, you know, we went there, we said our goodbyes, and then actually miraculously he started to make a recovery, which was great. But then my sister and I had this period of 6-7 weeks of him still being in hospital, where we were traveling backwards and forwards and alternating, traveling backwards and forwards to North Wales, which is quite the journey from London, you know, trying to do it in between work or on weekends or whenever we could get there to look after him, to support him. And obviously that was quite a traumatic thing. And then again, as he started to get better, as that situation started to ease down again, the panic attacks started coming back in. So as soon as that serious situation taking up all my brain space went, then the panic attacks, crept back in. Go on.
And was that kind of similar? Because I think you said when you know, at the beginning, when your parents were going through that divorce and Rob was off on tour, you were able to kind of detach yourself and detach your emotion and kind of cope with what was a kind of a crisis, right?
Yeah.
And then in this time as well, when your dad went in hospital, actually what your mindset actually was that detachment as well, to get through the crisis. And it's when it sounds like that when your mind reconnected with, or you allowed yourself to feel again and be feel those emotions, that's when everything started to carry on.
Comes back. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. That's really true. And definitely the case. It's like as soon as your brain hasn't got something to hook onto, it hasn't got a problem to solve, or, you know, and I'm a problem solver. I've always been that way. But as soon as my brain didn't have that one key thing to focus on and to solve, it just sort of went into give up mode. And so I got to this point where dad was starting to get better, that situation was starting to improve, but the panic attacks had come back in again. So now I'm talking like 5-6 panic attacks a day. They're happening at the supermarket. They're happening in my flat, which had always felt like a safe zone to me because they hadn't happened in my flat before. Yeah. So they're starting to happen in places that you can't avoid and places where you feel safe. So then you start to feel incredibly vulnerable and really exposed to this horrible thing that's happening. And then again, another hit. So a very close family member was suicidal and ultimately came to live with Rob and I so that we could take care of them and keep an eye on them, essentially, because, you know, they were in a place where they were threatening to do something. Again, my brain went into coping mode. I've got something to focus on. I've got another person that I need to support. And so the panic attacks subsided. Again, when that situation improved, back in they crept. And the thing that I wanted to get across when I was talking about this was, I don't think people realize when people talk about anxiety or they talk about panic attacks, I don't think people realize, unless they've had one, just how terrifying they are. And I'm quite a confident, outgoing, stable, whatever other adjectives you want to use, person. These floored me. And when I say that I became a shadow of myself, I really did. Like, I was essentially agoraphobic. I didn't recognize myself. I didn't feel like myself. My husband was having to deal with this person that was just crying, was too frightened to go outside, was too frightened to go on a tube, was turning down invitations because they were too frightened to do anything. And the fear wasn't, you know, I wasn't afraid of the tube. I loved the tube. What I was frightened of, and what a lot of people will go on to tell you when they deal with anxiety, is the fear of having a panic attack. Yeah. The panic attack is so frightening that you avoid any situation where you might have to be exposed to feeling that way, because it is absolutely a body sensation, a full body sensation. And it's not just the tingling hands, the racing heart, the inability to breathe, the feeling that you're going to faint. Your brain, your mind, you can't think logically when you're in the midst of a panic attack. Your brain takes you to some other dimension where you can't form a clear thought. If someone's saying to you, breathe deeply, take some deep breaths, calm down, you're fine, you're safe, it's okay, you can't focus on those things. They're meaningless when you're in that moment. Your brain is like scrambled eggs. It's completely scrambled. And I think until you've had one, you can't necessarily understand what it's like. And the other dimension to that was all of this was happening 4 or 5 years ago. And suddenly mental health was becoming more talked about. So people were talking about mental health a lot more in the press. People were talking about it on social media. It was becoming much more of a thing. And almost everybody was coming out of the woodwork saying, I've got anxiety. Oh my God, I've had such a panic attack about this, or, you know, this gives me major anxiety. And I suppose it's a bit like when you have people saying they're really OCD when they're not properly OCD, you know, when they haven't been diagnosed with OCD. It's a completely different thing to have anxiety at the level that I was experiencing it, or the panic attacks that I was experiencing, versus, you know, the flippant use of the language that we hear a lot. So it was, you know, of all of the horrible things that happened over that long period of time, the domino effect of like one thing after another, that anxiety was by far the most difficult of all of those things to cope with. It really was like my brain had just hit like the switch off button.
I think it'd be interesting because you're very aware of what anxiety is, from your perspective, right? From a personal perspective, I've always struggled to understand what being anxious feels like. To me, it feels quite complicated. I don't really know what it means. And it's interesting what you said about people talking a lot about, oh, I'm anxious, you know, I'm having a panic attack, you know, and how would you define anxiety or being anxious?
The first thing for me was obviously the panic attack. So these very physical, very obvious attacks of intense anxiety. You feel like you're going to die. Your brain tells you that you're going to die. So that was the first thing. But over time, I remember waking up in the morning, and you know the sensation that you have before you have an exam, or maybe an exam that you haven't revised hard enough for, and it's less a feeling of anticipation and more a feeling of dread.
Okay,
it's something that and it makes you not want to have your breakfast. You know, it's that kind of feeling where you just feel this dis-ease in your body. Your chest feels tight and heavy. You feel quiet. You feel like you don't want to socialize. You feel like you want to go and hide. I remember, you know, a few months into having these panic attacks, because I ended up having them for about 2 years in the end. But a few months into it, that's when that kind of sensation started to develop. And every morning I'd wake up and I'd just have this feeling of, I just don't want to have to deal with the panic attacks today. I just want to be able, I've got a big meeting at work. I just want to be able to get on a tube without thinking about it. I want to be able to go and see a friend without stressing about it for 48 hours beforehand, because I know that I'm going to have to try and navigate myself across London in a way that I'm not going to have a panic attack. Or it's exhausting. The whole situation is exhausting. So for me, anxiety felt like, aside from the acute panic attacks, anxiety just felt like a constant sensation of dread. It's like it saps your ability to relax. It saps your ability to laugh, to have fun. It's like having a big, I don't want to say cloud over you, because that's too much of a cliche. You know, it doesn't feel like there's a cloud over you, but it makes your body feel uncomfortable.
I mean, to be honest, probably the most articulate expression of anxiety. I suppose it's, people often equate anxiety with a feeling, but actually the feeling, like you said, is one of, it's quite complicated. There's some physical sensations, there's feelings of dread, which is a feeling in itself, which goes to show that it's a very complex, and I assume like pretty like, you know, multiple layered sensation.
Totally. And people often, you know, when I was trying to find an explanation for the way that I was feeling, often these conversations are around emotional feelings. I feel sad, or I feel anxious. But for me, the whole thing was a physical manifestation. And that's something that I really wasn't expecting. It's something that I didn't understand until I went through it myself. And so when I was, you know, before I'd gone through this myself, I would talk to people and they'd say they had anxiety or they'd had a panic attack, and I'd be like, oh, okay, that's all, that must have been awful. But until you go through it yourself and you realize that it takes over, one of the scariest things about it is it's a total lack of control. You feel like you've lost control, not only of your mind, because you feel like you're going crazy when you're going through this, but you also lose control of your body. You know, you can't stop these physical sensations from taking over, and they could happen at any moment. You know?
Were you like, so a couple of things, like, were you able to feel when one was going to come on? And then when one did come on, were you able to ease yourself out? Was it a way of, or was it a waiting game effectively?
Yeah.
And then with the people around you who supported you through this such difficult time, you know, how did they support you through those, maybe those particular events, but then also perhaps a little bit more broadly?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So yes, I could feel them coming on. And then, you know, you get to the point where...
Is that within seconds? You had a moment's notice?
Well, no, because for me, you know, I used to force myself and I'd go, come on, this is ridiculous. I used to get really frustrated with myself. This is ridiculous. Get on the tube. And I remember my office was in King's Cross at that time. And I remember walking from Angel to King's Cross station going, and I was building myself up to it the whole time, you know, but I was getting clammy palms. As soon as I left the office, I'd get clammy palms. I'd probably be thinking about it about 45 minutes before I had to leave the office, actually. And I'd probably be waiting for a quieter time, you know, when there weren't going to be so many people on the tube. So I'd start anticipating it. I'd get the clammy palms, I'd get the raised heartbeat, and then it's almost like a force field. Your body's like, don't get on this tube, don't go. And of course, with London tubes, you know, as soon as you walk through the door, particularly in the height of summer, you get hit by that wall of heat. And then you go down the escalators, you go really deep underground. And I was on the Victoria line and the Northern line, right? So you're going really deep underground. It's stagnant, hot air. And I just knew I was going to have a panic attack as soon as I got on the train. And sure enough, as soon as I got on the tube, bam. And so then you're like, okay, I know that this is my body. These are a trigger. Surely I can overcome this trigger. Surely I can just breathe through it. Or if I do some calm breathing, or if I listen to a podcast, or if I listen to some music, then I'll be able to conquer this and I'll be able to keep it cool. And I remember, you know, 1 or 2 times I'd go, come on, get yourself on the tube, just do it. And you get on it and it would be okay. And the carriage would be quite quiet and you'd get through it. And I'd get home and I hadn't had a panic attack, and it would be elation, Matt, like pure elation. And then I'd have one as soon as I got off, you know, as soon as I got up the stairs, or as soon as I got back to the flat. So they were always there. But yeah, I could feel them coming on. I was having them so regularly that I knew that I was probably going to have a couple of days. So I was anticipating them, which almost certainly didn't help. And then how did my friends and family cope? The biggest thing was my husband, Rob. And I said earlier on, I'd had this huge guilt about the fact that Rob had married this quite vivacious, confident, fun, happy human. And then, you know, little after a year into our marriage, I'm suddenly this incredibly boring, very difficult, crying a lot, crazy human. You know, I'd had a complete personality transplant and I didn't know what to do about it. At the start, he also couldn't understand it. You know, he was a bit like me before I experienced all this stuff. He'd never experienced it himself. You know, of course, being in the military, he's surrounded by things like PTSD a lot of the time, but actually speaking in detail about how something felt and how it manifested, and that this wasn't something that I could control, and this wasn't something that I was able to deal with on my own. It took a long time for him to understand that, and to see me lying on the floor at home, crying, not wanting to, you know, not knowing what to do, wanting to give up, not knowing how to handle living like that anymore. So it was very difficult, but over time he started to understand it, and then he started to understand how to help me. And, you know, later on when we go on to talk about the tools and things that helped, there was one book in particular that I read, which was Jog On by Bella Mackie. And I don't know if anyone's mentioned that on this series yet, but Jog On by Bella Mackie was a real turning point for me. It was released in the middle of me going through what I was going through. And it was the first time that I'd read, and she's brilliantly articulate. She's an ex-journalist, and she went on to write this book. It was the first time that I'd read someone explaining exactly how I felt. And that was the first time out of everything that I'd done. You know, I'd gone to the GP. I went to the GP. He prescribed talking therapy. So I got diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. He prescribed me with NHS talking therapies. Obviously, I had to wait 6 weeks, as is the standard, to be able to get those. And at that time, 6 weeks felt like a lifetime. I didn't think, you know, when you're in that state, 6 weeks is a lifetime. You
It's
know,
a long time anyway, right?
It's a long time anyway. But when you're feeling like that, you know, every day is difficult. Every day is really fucking difficult. And you're desperate for something that's going to help you get back to your old self or make the world feel normal again. Because when you're in this situation, and I know that you feel the same way, Matt, is when you're in this, the world feels like a different place. You know, it feels unfamiliar, it feels unfriendly, everything feels different. And as a consequence, you feel different. So, you know, when I went to these NHS talking therapies, the sessions were okay. You know, I did a biosciences degree, so I'm quite medical and quite pragmatic in my approach to what's going on. Like, maybe that's why I didn't go and speak to someone for such a long time, because I thought that this is a panic attack. This is why my body feels this way. This is because of adrenaline. This is because, you know, these are happening for XYZ reasons. I felt like I knew it all, and so I didn't need to go and see someone. And I think I felt that way as well when I went to go and see the NHS counsellor. You know, I totally understood what they were talking about, but it didn't explain to me why this had happened. Like, why have I developed? I can understand that in the midst of a panic attack, I feel this way because adrenaline has been released into my bloodstream, and, you know, my legs feel like they're going to jelly because they're getting ready to run, and my heart's pumping because, you know, I'm getting more oxygen in so that I can run away from the tiger. Like, I understand all of this, but it's not explaining to me why this is happening to me when I've been fine before. What's the root cause, and why can't I cope anymore? Why has my brain reached that point where I can't cope anymore? So to get back to Bella Mackie, when I read the Bella Mackie book, that was the first time that I was like, this is how I feel. Someone else feels like I feel. I'm not on my own. I'm not the only person. And also, I bought a copy for my mum, a copy for my sister, and a copy for Rob. And suddenly they had this much better articulated insight into what was going on in my own brain, how I was feeling and why I was feeling that way.
First, I really like that, like, in terms of you getting copies, and actually, you know, them, you know, obviously they're your loved ones loving you, so they go and read it, right? And but it's interesting. So we started this, and, you know, and we said that we hope that this conversation can resonate with someone else, just like you found when you read Bella Mackie's book, right? What do you think it is that's so powerful about hearing? Because I'm sure that reading Bella Mackie didn't necessarily give you the reason why you were feeling like that, but there's something incredibly powerful about knowing that someone else has experienced something like you have. And why is that?
It was so comforting to me, because it felt like someone understood me. And I'd spent such a long time going through this and trying to explain to the people that loved me and that I loved the most what I was experiencing and what I was feeling. And actually, it makes me emotional now, because it's so difficult to explain it or to try and describe it. And also, you know, there was me thinking, I'm newly married. My husband already thinks I'm a weirdo. You know, I'm on a one-way ticket for a divorce. So a lot of the time I didn't tell him the full extent of stuff, because I still wanted to be that shiny, newlywed, and so even though he got the brunt of it and he got me like not wanting to go out of the house and he got me like at my very worst, there was still stuff that, I wasn't completely open about and couldn't completely say, because you don't want to worry your friends and family, and you don't want to give them this extra stress, and they're already dealing with such a lot. You don't want to give them more. So for me, reading Bella Mackie's book was like a friend hearing and understanding and knowing and nodding along. And she'd say some things that would make me go, laugh out loud, because, or just go. I remember walking through St James's Park again on a mammoth divergent to avoid a tube on my way to work, and I was walking through St James's Park, and I remember there's this beautiful bridge in St James's Park which you can look over at Buckingham Palace, and it was early in the morning, so you've got this beautiful scene of like the mist on the water and the ducks. And she'd said, I can't remember, she described a sensation, or she described a feeling, and it was the first time that someone, and I can't remember specifically what it was, but it was the first time that someone else had said something that I thought only I knew, or that I thought only I felt. And I remember stopping on that bridge and just looking up and going, like, it was a really emotional moment, because there's something about shared experience. It just felt like talking to someone who truly understood. And I wasn't even in a dialogue with her, Matt. Like, I was listening to her audiobook. But for the first time, that was like the connection point where someone completely understood, and I didn't have to fight to explain what was going on.
And I think as well, like you say, you said, I think you articulated really well in terms of like someone finally understood, but there's a sense of like not feeling alone, isn't there? There's something very, very powerful about being alone, even though, I mean, you can be alone in a marriage, you can be alone in a, surrounded by friends and family, you can still feel alone. And it sounded like in some respects, like whilst everyone around you was there to support, like they couldn't understand what you were going through, because they really couldn't. Exactly. So therefore, you would keep things with them. You would feel alone. But when you made that connection with someone to say, actually, I'm not actually alone, and this person who I'm not even talking to, they are mechanical vibrations in my ears. But I now feel less alone, and that is there's. And I think what makes us profoundly human is that people often talk about what is being a human being, and it is around that feeling of, perhaps it's genetic. I mean, frankly, you're the biomedical scientist. You could tell me, but
this is a long time ago that I did my degree.
Yeah, but there's something innate within us, that these shared experiences and shared conversations and mutual understanding, and there's that drive to be understood and not alone can be a remedy in itself for some really big issues.
I really think it is, and that's definitely true. We're a social species. Way back when you would have had a small community and everyone would have supported each other. And we do live in a different world now, and particularly living in London. I was in my early 20s living in London. It is a lonely place, and a lot of people say that. And you might be surrounded by people, but an actual connection or a feeling of a security blanket in terms of a community isn't necessarily there. So a lot of the time you do feel like you're on your own, or you're doing it on your own, for sure.
And so moving forward, be very interested to understand some of the kind of the tools and techniques that have helped you cope, but also if you don't mind talking about it, in how that journey was to recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bella Mackie's book Jog On, how running saved my life, talks a lot about how she went from being a complete non-runner to running. And she goes on this journey, literal and metaphorical, of running through the streets of London. And I think her first run was, like in a back alley, because she was too embarrassed to run in front of people. So she just ran up and down a back alley for a while. And then it extended, and her journey goes on to, she's running tens of miles across London every day, and it's her therapy and it's her coping strategy, and it makes her feel good. And I've always run. So I've run my whole life. I've always been very sporty. And running definitely was a huge thing. But I would say that when I was in the midst of this situation, I couldn't go running because I was too frightened to go running. And I'd been for a run and I'd had a panic attack on a run, and I'd gone blind, essentially. I couldn't see anything. And I remember having to hold on to a railing and just stand clutching onto a railing and waiting for it to pass, because it does always pass. You know, you learn to realize that the feeling always passes, and then you just start getting frightened about it again. But the turning point for me, as well as running, and I'll talk about running in a bit more detail later, but the turning point for me was actually a really scary thing that happened. And I'd seen this NHS talking therapies person, and I hadn't really, you know, it's different for everybody, but it hadn't really worked for me. Again, I felt like a bit of a know-it-all, and I'll admit that. And I'd, you know, yeah, okay, I understand, but tell me more, like, why? But why? The turning point came for me when I woke up in the middle of the night. And by this point, I'd probably been having panic attacks and dealing with anxiety, dealing with these feelings, and this like total personality transplant for about 18 months. So I was exhausted. Like, I thought I was never coming back. I thought that was me, like my normal self gone. It was all I thought about, all I talked about. I was just, well, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and I had what I now know is an intrusive thought. And I'd had this horrible compulsion, and I call it a compulsion because it wasn't a feeling or a thought. It was a compulsion to get out of bed and to go into the kitchen and to get a knife and to hurt myself, or worse. And I can't describe it, but it was almost like my legs were leaving the bed. My legs were kind of making tracks out of the bed, and the duvet was coming off me, and my brain was going, I don't want to do, what are you doing? What is going on? Like, this is terrifying. What's going on? I don't want to do this. But my body was kind of taking me there. And it was like it was a compulsion. It was like someone was saying, you need to go into the kitchen. I wasn't hearing voices or anything like that. It was just like, oh, you need to go into the kitchen and you need to do something to yourself. Terror, complete terror. Like, this was a new dimension, right? So this had gone from awful panic attacks, but they're panic attacks, to game changing. This is quite serious now, and this is really terrifying. And I woke up Rob and told him what had happened, and he reassured me. And by this point, he'd got quite good at coping and looking after me and calming me down. But I remember being like, please, can you put something in front of the door so that you can hear the door open if it happens again, so that you can stop me. And that was really frightening. I mean, I went back to bed, and, you know, I didn't do anything, and that compulsion never came back, and that feeling never came back. But that was deeply frightening. Yeah. And so the next day I called a private therapist. I researched therapists and spoke to friends who had therapists, and I got in touch with someone who was brilliant, and I met her the next day. And really speaking to her is what started the recovery process.
And did those very scary kind of thoughts, did they continue, or was it random, like the panic attacks, or was it
I never had another one. I've only ever had that one, and that one is so clear and vivid. I will say that it was I found that so frightening, and I became really frightened of that happening again. And I travel a lot for work, which is a great perk of my job, but I used to get really anxious in another sense of traveling for work because I knew I was on my own in a hotel room, and there was no one there that would be able to stop me or help me. And I had a really terrible panic attack on a trip to Amsterdam once. And again, I didn't really tell anyone at work that this was going on. So you have this like terrible experience and then have to go in and present or go in and be level-headed in meetings all day. But yeah, that was really frightening. But luckily, thankfully, I didn't have another one. But it just shows again, like what your brain can do, how powerful your brain is.
And also, like you describe it, your mind can almost split, and you can almost have a running commentary.
You're having a fight with yourself.
What are you doing?
Yeah, what are you doing? Like, what are my legs doing? What's going on here? Who's in control?
Legs, stop legs. Yeah. No, hold on. Legs aren't stopping. What's going on?
The whole thing.
But you can see how that can really escalate. The fear can. I mean, that's incredibly frightening.
It's really frightening. So, tools and what eventually ended up helping me was, I went to go and see a private therapist, and I fully appreciate that. Not everyone's able to do that. So, I say it with a caveat. It did really help me. I think in any of those situations, it's about finding what works for you. With me and the NHS counsellor, often it's just a personality thing. And perhaps if I'd found somebody different, or if I'd pushed to find someone different, then I would have had a different experience. But for me, speaking to Melanie is what was her name? That really helped me. And then running, I know that Bella Mackie talked all about running. I'd always run before. Eventually I got to a place where I stopped having panic attacks when I was on the run. And even now, all these years later, I have to run. And because we were together for New Year's, Matt, and that I went running on the 1st of January in the morning.
I should have come with you.
There was no pressure. Hey, you swam in the sea. I didn't swim in the sea. But I really realized that if I don't run, then I really notice a difference in my overall mood. I feel a bit grumpy, a bit kind of argumentative. If I run, I feel so much better. And I'm really lucky that I'm training for a half marathon at the moment, which is forcing me to get out every weekend.
Well, I was going to say, like, what happens, like, when there's periods where you don't want to run or you don't want to exercise, or is that thought of, or that fear of what happened in the past so great that you're like, no matter what, I will go running?
Yeah, it's difficult because when you don't want to run, it's almost impossible to get yourself out, right? I would say the first thing is I'm what I would call better now. So I left London with Rob being in the military. We move around a lot. We left London. We went to Salisbury. Being in the countryside helped a huge amount. Being away from London, not having to put myself on a tube if I didn't want to, not having to walk outside your front door and just be surrounded by thousands of people straight away. Those things helped, I must admit. And again, I know that's not an opportunity for everyone. That's not open to everybody. But that definitely helped. And then we went into lockdown. So I was also forced to be at home and to be in my safety zone and to not have to be exposed to things that I didn't want to do, or that, made me anxious, or busy social settings or whatever, all these things that I sort of loved once upon a time, but ended up having to crawl away from because my brain just couldn't handle them. So I would say that I am in a place now where I'm not so worried about panic attacks, that, I haven't had one for a really long time. Which is amazing. And, if they do come, I'm in a much better place to be able to deal with them, and the odd chance that I have had a couple over the last couple of years, I've known it will pass. It always passes. And, as someone once described them to me, when you're having panic attacks, it's because you've got it's like a broken car alarm, right? Your brain is at full capacity, that you're constantly setting off the alarm. The smallest thing will set the alarm off. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, and to fix that, you have to fix your brain. And your brain is like any other muscle. If it's had a trauma, it needs recovery time, and you need to give it a bit of a break, and you need to give it chance to heal itself. And so for me, being away from London helped. running helps, keeping that routine. And that's another big thing for me, is an importance of routine. Actually, when I look at all of the things that have triggered mental health issues for me, like phobias, I have health anxiety, and I also have used to have a huge phobia of flying. These are all things that focus or sit within a lack of control or a loss of control. And I'm sure that's where a lot of my panic attacks stemmed from as well, was this loss of control and the fear of a loss of control. You know, the world is spiraling around you and you don't feel like you have a handle on it anymore. Having that routine really helps, and having structure to my day really helps. But
I was going to say, I think it's about knowing yourself as well, right? It's about knowing what you need, and like you say, feeding your brain with what you need. But in order to do that, you've got to understand yourself, and feeding you required exercise, structure, talking with someone who could really help and understand, reading. There's these things that you need for your brain, which, like you said, we all talk about this idea that one size doesn't fit all, but you've got your toolkit of what you need, and by putting that in place, you create habits for yourself, which you can then build you up on a solid platform. And then you build that kind of that overall resilience, so you are able to cope. And then if you do slip, and everyone slips, right? There's always, life hits you, with challenges left, right, and center. You seem now aware of how to recenter yourself.
Yeah, exactly that. For me, I've always said I run for my brain, I don't run for my body, and of course it's not for everybody, but I just feel better, I feel calmer, I feel more able to cope if I go for a run. And actually, even just going for a walk has the same benefits. Like I think everyone can, putting on some great music and going for a walk can definitely make you feel better. And as you say, talking openly is so important. And I know that you and I both speak really openly about this stuff, and that's how we've ended up on this podcast, because we're not afraid to say how are you, but really, how are you? And talk about it and support each other with that. But
I just laughing because, like, I think when we saw you at New Year, I hadn't seen you in, frankly, a very long time, relatively. I mean, I know pandemic, nothing's really happened since, but and it was like, I think within 2 minutes we sat down with a cup of tea.
Straight into the big stuff.
So how are you? I'm pretty dark. You're like,
yeah.
This is awesome. Yeah, this is great. This is what
because
I need.
it's real, isn't it? And you do tend to you do tend to bumble through life going, I'm really well, thanks. How are you? And actually you're going, oh God, if only I could tell you how I actually feel, because actually I'd rather be anywhere but here right now. But I think talking openly to people that you trust is really important, and people who understand as well, because talking to someone who, we don't know each other that well, Matt, but you understand. So talking to you is almost better than talking to a close friend that I've had for years who doesn't understand. Because
in that specific situation,
because it hits a different spot, doesn't it? But I also think there's definitely something, and this is something that I wanted to get across on this podcast today, is there's a lot to be said for the passing of time as well. And for me, in my experience, I know that people deal with anxiety and depression, which is very much long term, and there are different reasons for that. But for me, within my specific situation where I felt like I was completely knocked off my feet by something, that like I said earlier, the world was a different place. I became a different person completely. Like me talking on this today, I am a million miles away from the person that I was when I was going through this. So often it's difficult for people to see or to realize or to believe, because I have come back through that process, and I'm come out the other side of it. But there is a lot to be said for the passing of time, and I want to reassure someone or anyone who's listening to this who needed this conversation, the same conversation that I was looking for when I was going through it, that it does get better, and you will get back to who you were before, and the world will feel safe again, and you will feel like your old self again. Of course it's different for everybody, but it was really difficult when I was reading up on all of these things, even on the NHS website. You know, you read about it and these things always seem like a really long term, you know, this is you for life now, and it can be really difficult for you to get your head around that. And I just want to be an example for some people who will be lucky, like I am, that I've come out the other end, and that is possible for others too. And you can get back to your old self again. And, you know, not to lose the hope that that will happen, because I did lose hope and I did feel like this would never happen, but it really has. And anxiety for me is the hardest thing that I've ever dealt with out of everything that happened. Hands down the hardest thing. Like, it nearly broke me. I really honestly didn't think that I could recover from it or get through. I thought that was me, like, done. Right? I really did. But time is a healer, and for me that's what worked. Time, you know, and also life getting a little bit calmer. There hasn't been a disaster for a while, apart from COVID, you know, that old global pandemic, which sort of
lingering in the background. But I think we can't, you know, you think you're very, you know, very, you know, I suppose very humble about that, you know, what you're saying about yourself. But I think you've got to, I think, realize that actually, you know, you did do a lot of hard work. There was a lot of hard work, and there was also a willingness to want to get better. And that was, it sounds like, you know, you getting better didn't just happen. There was a road to recovery, and it was very steep, but you powered on. Yeah,
but there is that, but it does feel like a fight. It does, you know, you do feel it. You are fighting something that you don't understand and that you can't see. But also, I didn't really feel like I had a choice. You know, it was either get through this or give up. And so actually, I don't think that was ever really an option for me. It was never something that I wanted to do. Don't get me wrong. There were times when I was like, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to live like this anymore. If this is what my life is like, I don't want to have it anymore. And that's awful, right? Because I'm incredibly, like, I've got amazing family, and everyone says this, you know, in this situation. I've got amazing family, amazing friends, a great job. You know, how dare I have the right to say any of those things? But none of that matters when you're in your own head, and none of that matters when you're dealing with something like anxiety or depression, because it's too big, you know, it takes over too much of your brain for you to be able to make sense of the logical right answer, which is don't go anywhere.
And purely it's not logical.
It's not logical.
It's not logical.
It's not logical, but I tell you what, I have this huge, it really, for me, coming out of the other side of it, I have a completely different appreciation for mental health, poor mental health, people dealing with anxiety or depression. I now approach it completely differently when I'm talking to people who are suffering or going through something. And I also, you know, I have a team that I manage, and I prioritize their mental health as well, hugely. And I make that a big part of my job, and me in a leadership role at work. That is a huge part of what I prioritize. And if I notice that anyone of my team is not themselves or not feeling quite right, we talk about it, and I make sure that they are open about it, and we manage workloads and we prioritize it. And we're starting to see that shift in a lot of corporations, which is great now, that this isn't just, whatever, mental health. This is a real thing that can take someone who is stable, strong, normal, confident, outgoing, the last person you'd expect to deal with something like this, can absolutely floor them for a long time. And that, you know, you can't underestimate the power of the brain in doing that. And so I have a completely different appreciation for it now. And I think that, you know, that wanted to sound like a massive cliche. I think that I'm much better for it, and thank God I went through it, because I'm a different person for it now. And completely humbled by the experience, to be honest.
Yeah, and I'm sure as well, I'm sure the people that you work with are very appreciative of that support, especially during the last couple of years, which to have someone who is their manager, who does kind of put this at the very top of their priorities is, I mean, frankly, it's really important.
It is hugely. And you know what, my team is spread across the world, but they're mostly in Orlando. And so for my team in the US, they were dealing with the Trump administration, the Black Lives Matter movement, everything that was happening politically as well. It was a really difficult time for everyone. So yeah, it wasn't really an option not to prioritize mental health during that time.
Yeah. Tizzy, well, I just want to say thank you so much for not only a fascinating, insightful conversation, but also just for being so honest and also articulate about, because I think, you said earlier that, we can't, when panic attacks hit, it's not logical, it's completely irrational. Anxiety, depression, nothing to do with logic, but the way that you explain it and articulate it has actually, certainly given me a lot of kind of understanding into what you felt. I really do think that there'll be a lot of people out there who can really relate to what you said.
Well, good. And, if someone wants to talk, if someone's going through what I've described at the moment and they're in the thick of it at the moment and they want to have, a version of Bella Mackie to talk to themselves, but to have a two-way conversation, then, I'm completely open for that, and give them, reach out to me on LinkedIn or wherever you want to reach out to me. And let's for sure have that conversation.
Awesome. And thank you so much for your time, Tizzy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone listening. You can subscribe to us on most major podcast platforms, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Just search for Sidekick Community or Sidekick Stories and we'll pop up. And please do give us a rating if you like the show. And do check out our free Sidekick app for iPhone and iPad. It's a collection of interactive exercises, tools, and tips to help you boost your mental well-being. The app enables you to build a personalized well-being toolkit to help you deal with life's ups and downs. Just go to our website, www.sidekick.org.uk, and click the download now button in the header to take you to the App Store. Tizzy, thank you so much again.
Thank you.